Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again for the rest of the Vietnam Forum. The afternoon program will start with a look into the infrastructure and energy sector of Vietnam. Moderating this panel is Mr. Nguyen Thanh. The speakers include Ms. Vũ Quỳnh Lê, Dr. Lê Viet Phú, and Mr. Dave Sivaprasad. Mr. Thanh, please.
All right. Good afternoon. So welcome to our third panel, Infrastructure and Energy. I hope that you've got a lot of food, but also a lot of coffee. Always difficult to start a session right after lunch, but anyway, we have distinguished panelists for our panel this afternoon. To save time, I will not go through their wonderful biographies. You can all read from the conference package. But we'll have Ms. Vũ Quỳnh Lê, the Deputy General Director of the Government Procurement Agency from the Ministry of Planning Investment. I know that Ms. Lê has been very hard working on public-private partnership in infrastructure development in Vietnam, and in particular the challenges of drafting the first ever PPP law in Vietnam, and hopefully after many rounds of consultation will be approved by the National Assembly. So our first panelist, Ms. Vũ Quỳnh Lê, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Then I do hope that I'm the middle between your lunch and your early falling asleep. Then I do hope that my presentation will make you a little bit awake. So my presentation today is on the specific model that the government of Vietnam is promoting, which is a public-private partnership. And actually, we have embarked on this kind of investment some decades ago. It was started with our BOT, with the power sector and water supply sector. And we do have some experience, but when it comes to transportation sector, it seems somewhat challenge that we are still facing. And actually, when we come to the social sector, like the healthcare, building up and operate the hospital is still a challenge for us. Then PP in Vietnam at a glance. Then before 1998, we start with the BOT with two separate streams. Originally with the foreign investment scheme, and then afterward the domestic investment scheme. By 2005, as you may remember the presentation by Mr. Fredberg this morning, we had emerge a lot investment law where both private, foreign and domestic has been merged into one legal framework, which is the investment law. So we start to talk about the the PPP instead of instead of the concrete form of project from 2015, and now we are working on the preparation of the PPP law. And as Professor Xuan said, that this is the first ever law in our country. But I'm not sure whether it can fit all the expectation that many of us is having. So currently the PP is only under the government decree, and supersede. You can see that there are many others law, but if you look into this law, you can have you can see that all of these laws are somewhat conflicting when coming to the implementation of the PEP, and that's why there's a need to come with the proposal of PEP law to our National Assembly. And by today, we have successfully submitted the number 1 draft law to our National Assembly, and hopefully that by by this time next week, the plenary session of the National Assembly will discuss about that. So the infrastructure investment needed in Vietnam, I think I will not have to talk much about this here, but basically I think the number of the World Bank, the ADB, and HSBC is around 16 or 25 billion US dollar for the next 10 years. So this is the pictures of what we have done in the past. We had done 336 projects with different forms of the scheme, like the BOT and BT, BOO, BTR, and some of the mix between the BOT and BT. You may see that the majority of is from the transportation, but I have to say that the transportation project in PPP is mainly led by the domestic player. We haven't been successful in having the foreign investment in this kind of project. So I will come to the next part, which is the content of the law. So this October will be the first plenary session discussion by the National Assembly for new law, and hopefully we will have the law passed by next May 2020. So the first thing is that we narrow down the list of the sector. And I remember 1 month earlier, here in Singapore, under the Infrastructure Asia event, I was asked the question that why Vietnam government trying to narrow down the list of the sector. And those sector, I can name that that may be the industrial zone. Previously, we put it into the scope of the coverage for the PEP under Decree 63. But after the after the review of the implementation, we see that there are many industrial zones that is currently run under the traditional scheme, being the purely private investment. Then that's why we propose to the government that please make it purely investment, private investment. So the next thing may be the agriculture things, because in the agriculture sector there may be some transaction, but it's mainly for the hydraulic system, so irrigation system, and the internal discussion of MPI saying that it may be more suitable for the public investment. So that's the narrow down of the list. Number 2 is the minimum scale. When we look out to the international experience. The minimum scale of PP project is applied in many other markets, like the Canada or the Singapore previously. I know that at this moment, Singapore does not have such kind of maximum of the threshold anymore. But in order to, screen the project, we are now proposing the minimum threshold of the project, which is about 20 million. 10 million actually. So the project procedure, this is now the reflect the international practice, but frankly saying, in our country, the infrastructure, those who do the infrastructure, especially from the public sectors, still have some not so patient to the implementation to the development of infrastructure, so that when we try to apply this kind of procedure, many have still blame us that this is too lengthy and this is too cumbersome. So you may see that for the high-tech project, which is something thinking of some power plants, for example, when you can show that this is the high-tech project, then you can go through the shortcut. And for the BT project, we also have the different procedure for that. But actually, basically, the main procedure is still as what we are still enforcing the system to do. Actually, the experience of doing PEP in our country is that some public agencies seems to to choose the shortcut, being identify directly the investor, award the contract directly to one of the investor, and that create a lot of criticism in the system. Then with the law, we hope that we can have a higher regulatory sanction, so that people have to do more competitively in the market. So another proposal is that we are proposing the whole approach government way, so that not only MPI but also MOF and other Ministry of Planning and Ministry of Finance and other related ministry will come to the appraising process, whereby we won't say agreement to the project before we bring it to the market. Currently, as you may have listened to many of the previous speaker, that we are still very fragmented. Then by this, we do hope that we will have a more consistent in dealing with specific deals. And this is, and this is for the national importance project, and this process will be replicated in a lower level. So the contract type, I think that it reflects the practice elsewhere, except for the BT form. I wish that I have more time to talk with, especially with Professor Frans Sokyong here. So the state participation in the project, in the PEP project, has been tailored, compared to other existing law. But frankly saying, it is not. We envisage that we still have to face with difficulty if because this is the first time of doing PEP. Although we are carefully articulating in our law, but I myself still very afraid of the real implementation in how to say in this content. So this is the finalization of the construction costs and also the role of the export audit in our country, the payment of BLT, the payment for BT contract. So this is actually one kind of the land deal where the government want to swap the land's use rights and the construction, the public construction. So the operation of the project enterprise directly relate to Mr. Hai's presentation this morning. We are trying to come to closer, closer to the capital market so that we will have a wider base for the investment. So come to the government guarantee. This is a very hard topic, and we are proposing some mechanism for risk sharing mechanism and also some of the FX convertibility under the law. I'm not sure how far the discussion at the National Assembly will go. This is for the foreign exchange guarantee, the risk sharing on revenue. So another issue, another new thing is that the independent supervision for the BOT contract. You may share with us that some of our transportation deal has been, protested, has witnessed the protests from the drivers like that, and now we are trying to, to balance so that the driver can raise their voice to appropriate level. So the contract termination is also another new thing that we are intend to input into the law. So that is the new thing that we are proposing under the draft law on PEP. And I'm happy to take any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lê, for an advanced, broad overview of the draft PPP law that's actually currently being debated and hopefully ratified by the National Assembly early next year. I know that you have to rush in the end, especially on the parts that are actually quite important for potential investors, like the role of the government agency in the PPP project. The coverage of government's guarantee in terms of both revenue, debt, and FX exchange, and also various risk sharing mechanisms that will be governed under PPP. So hopefully we'll have time during the Q&A to, if the participants have specific questions on that area. But also, I know that there's also concern that this will be reduced in terms of scope, sector with the PP project, but at least the two largest sectors, energy and transport, are still there. And talking about energy, this is our second panelist, Dr. Viet, my colleague at the Fulbright School of Public Policy and Management. He has been studying sustainable development, renewable energy, and electricity pricing in Vietnam for the last 10 years now, and that will be his topic: renewable energy in Vietnam, trends and challenges. Dr. Viet.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back to Singapore after 15 years and to see all the great things going on around here. Today, my topic is about the energy sectors and my presentation has three parts. First part, I'm going to provide an overview of the power system in Vietnam, followed by some assessment of the energy sectors, the renewable energy penetration in Vietnam, and I conclude with some challenge. So some of the issues are very well known in Vietnam, and the others still emerging. I don't have time to go into detail, so if you have any question that I'm happy to answer outside the event. So here the overview of the power system in Vietnam. Vietnam is a long country, 2,000 kilometers from the north to the south. So the power system is divided into 3 parts. The northern section, oh sorry, can I go back? I want to find the later, yeah. So the northern subsystem, the central subsystem, and the southern subsystem. So there's the 500 kV, 500 kilovolts transmission line connecting the north to the south. And then there are also 220 kVs for interconnection in China region, and also for import from China and Laos to Vietnam, and export from Vietnam to Cambodia. Sorry. Yeah. The 3 parts have a very different resources. Historically, coal-fired power plant is located in the north because it's near the coal mine. Hydropower is in the I'm sorry, not get used to this. Okay, so hydropower is in the north, the central, and the south central province, because these are the river basins. The gas fires is in the south. In the past, there exists power supply in the north, so there's the power transmitted from the north to the south to the 500 kV transmission line. But the problem is that there's already bottlenecks. If you look at the power structure, 40% of power generation in Vietnam is coming from hydropower. The advantage of this structure is that it's very cheap, especially in the wet season, but it's also susceptible to adverse weather. Next slide. If you look at the growth rate of energy demand in Vietnam, the average growth rate is about 10 to 12% every year in the last 15 years. And this morning, my colleagues already mentioned that Vietnam has a very bright economic outlook. So if you make a projection, then Vietnam, the increase in energy demand is still like going in the next 5 years. And every year, Vietnam needs about 4,000 to 5,000 generation capacity. And if you convert, say, every 1 kilowatt hour generation needs about $2,000, and then every year Vietnam needs about 10 billion US dollar investment in generation capacity. If you compare this with other countries, Vietnam, the per capita consumption in power, in electricity, is about 220 kilowatt hour per person per year. The number in the US is about 13,013. Singapore is about 8,800. So there's a lot of room for Vietnam to grow. It also means that there's a lot of demand in terms of generation capacity. And then you look at, sorry, here we go. The load profile. The problem with the load profile in Vietnam is that there's a high intraday volatility. You look at the peak load and the peak load and the low demands. That's the volatility is very high. It means that during a certain time, you have to ramp up the supply. For example, you look at the picture here, only within 2 hours, 1 hour, 3,600 megawatts of capacity need to be generated. And it creates a huge problem for grid operator. If you look at this pattern, it means that there is a lot of room for solar power, because this is the morning. Not yet. I mean, this is not a good time for solar power yet. But we look at the pattern. The pattern means that there's a lot of room, a lot of interest for solar power to invest, because you can generate power during the daytime and meet certain demand. Of course, I'm not saying that there's no problem with solar, because you also have to increase the reserve margin and the spinning reserve, everything. So the big picture of the power system in Vietnam is that we need investment, but also we need grid management, DSM, demand side management, and smart grid storage. So that is the big picture of the power system in Vietnam. And then let's look at the trend and the opportunity for investment in RE in Vietnam. Vietnam has a lot of potential. In wind power alone, it's about 500 gigawatt of wind power. For solar power, it's about, For solar power, it's about 20 gigawatt of solar power for utility scale solar PV, and another 2 to 5 gigawatt for rooftop solar PV. So that's a lot of potential. Then in the past, the Vietnamese government has adopted a lot of policy and mechanism to promote solar and wind power in Vietnam. So here's an example of a list of the mechanisms. For example, currently the Vietnamese government is implementing feed-in tariff, a very high feed-in tariff for solar, and not very high for wind, but very good for solar. We are working with some development partner to make a transition from feed-in tariff to bidding, to auction and bidding for solar. It's not there yet. We don't expect it to be operation in 2020 yet, but in the future, definitely we would move to bidding system. There are also study on RPS, which is a renewable portfolio standard, direct PPA, ESCO, energy service company, smart grid storage, and small energy, small investment in clean energy and power to gas, EVs, and system to accommodate EV in Vietnam. So let's look at the feed-in tariff for solar, for renewable energy in Vietnam. This figure is a bit old. Actually, it's not too old. It's only in 2017. But there has been a lot of change with regard to solar and wind in the past few months. The feed-in tariff, which were effective in the past 2 years, about 9.35 cents per kilowatt hour, but it was already due in June 30 this year. The feed-in tariff is not there yet, but it's definitely expected to be lower because 9.35 is too high. The feed-in tariff for wind power is about, this figure is a bit old. The feed-in tariff for wind power, for offshore wind is about 9.8 cents per kilowatt hour. For inshore wind or onshore wind, it's 8.5. Still considered low compared to the world. So if we look at this, from the perspective of an investor, the feed-in tariff is relatively high for solar power, but it won't last. It will be the motivation of the domestic investor and also foreign investor in the past few years that they try to register their project and to invest in the project. But let's look at what happens actually. It's called the solar rush. It's a very unique phenomenon in Vietnam. Only in 6 months, there are 4,000 megawatts of solar capacity installed in Vietnam. From the first week of this year to June 30, 4,000. You would not see it in anywhere. 4,000. So this is a huge success in terms of the encouragement for investment in RE in Vietnam. But will this last? I encountered several questions from our colleagues yesterday, and the thing is that it is not. I move ahead a little bit. So the problem with the RE investment is that there are a lot of investment in the power generation, but there are little investment in transmission, and that is a problem. And the figures show that. So the curtailment has already occurred in most places, especially in Ninh Thuận and Bình Thuận, which is the two most potential provinces in the central Vietnam. The curtailment already occurred in Ninh Thuận. It's about the capacity of the transmission grid is only about 1,000 megawatts, but the investment there is already reached 3,000 megawatts. So about 2/3 of the power generated cannot be transmitted to the south. The load center is in the south. Transmission is the generation is in central province. So right now, if you are an investor, what do you look at? You look at not only the way how to invest, but also whether you can sell it. Because I'm going to the next part, which is the challenge of investing in Vietnam. So I group it into 3 categories. First one is called political or regulatory barrier. Second one is financial and economics. And third one is technical. Some are quite well known. So for example, Here's a list, so don't get discouraged by this because I'm not sure that many of you are aware of like the problem with the PPA. But let's understand the situation. The situation is like this: the Vietnamese government look at the big picture, the renewable energy sector as a trial period. So they put a very high feed-in tariff, but that's only effective for 2 years. After that, I mean, they learn how to improve the system and how to get the price down. So the new price is not there yet. But the proposal that I got, the new feed-in tariff for solar, for utility scale solar is around 709 cents, 7.09. For floating solar is 7.69, which is still very high compared to the world. The bidding system in India could get the price down to 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So if say if you compare from the perspective of EVN, the monopoly buyer of electricity in Vietnam, EVN would not have any incentive to purchase power from solar power because the average selling price in Vietnam is below the price of solar PV, the feed-in tariff. And also, there's problem, as I mentioned before, it's problem with the grid management, with stability, the grid stabilization, and it's just like some unofficial number. The unofficial number is that EVN itself has to pay about from 1 to 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour for reserve margin for every kilowatt hour purchased from solar PV. So if you say the average price in Vietnam, the average retail price is about 8.5 cents per kilowatt hour. If EVN is to pay about 7 cents per kilowatt hour from solar, they have to add another 1 to 1.5 cents for grid maintenance. So that would go to like the almost 8.5, and EVN and make no profits from buying from solar. That's why like the whole process is getting so complicated because EVN has no incentive. So that is the political, and you can read from here. I don't think that have enough time to go through, but anyway, some of this is well known from the web, and there are some proprietary information that I'm not very comfortable with going into detail. The economic and financial barrier I just mentioned about the price, and also last one, technical barriers. So technical barriers is almost about the transmission line and how Vietnam can make a transition from what is called the conventional centrally planned power generation with large coal-fired power plant to a distributed network with solar and wind and storage. So that will take some year. But because if you look back at what happened in Vietnam, it's very difficult for the Vietnamese government to build new coal power. The public resistance to coal power is huge, is fierce in Vietnam. So the only option is that they have to acquire more renewable energy, more solar and more wind. It will take some years, but I would expect that the plan for the Vietnamese government is that we would get about the information I got a little bit old is that Vietnam would install 850 megawatt of renewable energy by 2020 and 4,000 by 2025 and 12,000 by 2030. But that number has already been met, and we expect the transition from the conventional wisdom coal-fired power plant to more renewable energy is it's a lot quicker than you would imagine you would see in other countries. So that is on my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Viet Phu. From what I get from your presentation, is actually after many, many years of just talking about potential in renewable energy, actually we are seeing a huge jump in actual investment, at least in solar, and that's actually in fact due to the new feed-in tariff policy that the government promulgated 2 years ago. But still significant challenges remain, one of which is still the uncertainty of the future pricing mechanism, whether it's continued feed-in tariff but at lower prices, or will be long-term PPAs, and also actually The second kind of challenge is on lack of investment in grid transmission to support renewable. And I guess the third challenge actually you haven't mentioned, and maybe they ring the bell so many times, is actually if you talk about energy sector, right? I mean, anywhere in Vietnam particularly, you have so many interest groups asking for everything. So usually in Vietnam, like, we have plans for everything, but all plans are easily amended, right? You want coal, yes, you can do coal. You want gas, you can do gas, hydro, and now renewable. So it's all over the place. But actually one thing that we are seeing positive coming out of it is with the recent successes in renewable, and also what is happening out of the intense negotiation between the US and Vietnam is the the parallel development of renewable and also gas power plant. I think Vietnam is also under tremendous pressure to import LNG from the US, at least in the short term, to balance the trade relation between the US and Vietnam. But also in the long term is, if you want to get away from dirty coal, it is renewable and gas. So gas maybe import, high cost import of LNG, but also Vietnam still have a lot of potential in exploration and development of new gas resources. And that comes to our third panelist, Dev Sivaprasad. He leads the Boston Consulting Group's office in Quynh, but also actually his specialty is in energy, and he is heading the energy group within BCG. So it's love to have you here, Dev, and look forward to your presentation, and maybe you also can get into the points raised by the first two speakers, the PPP, but PPP in energy, and also oil and gas with renewable.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your kind invitation for us to share some perspectives on oil and gas. I'll start with a bit of a global perspective on where the oil industry is going, share a bit of data and share some context for Vietnam in oil and gas, and offer you a few thoughts on the priorities for the industry. And some of that links back to some of the discussion from before. So the oil and gas industry, as many of you would know or have read in the press, is going through massive change on a number of fronts. So the long-term profile for demand is changing with energy transition, climate change. There is no longer a discussion about peak oil supply, it's about peak oil demand, and where that demand is going is changing. There's also a fair bit of recognition that the long-term price for hydrocarbons is going to be low and is likely to face pressure to go even lower in the long term, with some short-term volatility. Now, oil companies are also under a lot of pressure from stakeholders, from investors, to respond to climate change and energy transition, and they are responding, they're shaping their portfolios. What you'll see across the industry is this massive shift from oil to gas, and every major oil company has taken steps to shift their portfolio. And finally, all of this also in the context of technology transition, Industry 4.0, that is changing the business models and how the industry works. So massive change globally, and an expectation that this change is going to accelerate with time. So let me then move to Vietnam and share some data with the context of the industry. Okay. So Vietnam, let me share some cost and productivity data. So this is production costs in Vietnam. Relative to other countries in the region is relatively high. So competing in the region for placing hydrocarbons is challenging. Right? what you saw was production cost, so how much it costs to take a barrel of oil out or a unit of gas out. The investment cost is also quite high in Vietnam, and a lot of this is related to the technical complexity of the resource, but there are other reasons that are related to this as well. We'll get into in a bit. Right? So attracting investment is a challenge when you have a disadvantaged cost structure. You take a high cost structure and then you compare that also with the average government take. So what the hydrocarbons developed, what economic value it generates, how much does the state take? And Vietnam actually is quite high relative to competing, let's say, oil-producing countries. So this paints a picture of it's quite challenging to then attract investment if you have high technical costs and you have high government take. Right? And then you overlay that against the domestic consumption of hydrocarbon and the domestic production. What you see on those bars is the production, and what you see on the red line is the consumption. So this is a widening gap. So you need a lot of investment to accelerate development domestically, to at least narrow the gap. Right? Now that's perhaps the less encouraging news is the high cost structure, the high government take, and the big delta you need to fill. But there's some positive story to this as well. When you look at the undiscovered, undeveloped reserves in Vietnam, there is some material volumes in the country. And a big part of that is actually gas, right? And as Dr. Lay was saying, gas has a huge contribution to be had in the power sector. So if you look at that growth rate on power demand, what that practically means is the capacity needed in the country for power is going to double by 2030. And the 4 to 5 gigawatts, just to put it in context, is like adding a new Myanmar in capacity in Vietnam every year. It's a massive amount of capacity that you need to add. Now, it has to come from all sources to meet that level of demand. Certainly renewables, gas, hydro, and hydro, of course, is limited by what you have. But gas plays a big role. And if you have domestic gas reserves in the ground, developing that gas reserves and bringing it to market domestically has multiple benefits. It is more competitive for the country relative to importing LNG, where the prices are higher and you're exposed to global volatility. And second, and this is true in every oil-producing country, the huge multiplier effect you will have in local supply chains and local content. So high volume that is undeveloped, unexplored, huge potential, but there are constraints, right? There are constraints that are limiting the development of this, and we'll get into that at the end of this discussion. So I thought it might be helpful to reflect a bit on some learnings from other countries that have faced not exactly the same challenge, but similar challenges. And the UK is one of them. So the UK has been producing oil and gas for many decades. It is now a highly mature oil province. Its peak production was somewhere in, say, 4 or 5 million barrels a day. Now it's about 1.5, 1.7 or something like that, right? And steady decline, increasing cost structure, aging facilities, aging infrastructure. And what the UK did was that it responded with fairly interventionist policy and regulatory response. So it set up a oil and gas authority that was much more interventionist in managing the oil industry, and it did a couple of things which had a huge impact. First, it reformed the fiscal structure, and it improved the incentive structure for investors coming into the market, and it made it a bit more diverse. So it had different commercial models for, say, PE-backed players or late life field specialists versus, you know, the big oil companies. So horses for courses, let's say. It encouraged and put in place conditions that increase collaboration across oil companies and the supply chain. So service companies, engineering companies, and so on, that reduce the cost structure and unlock potential which was otherwise locked in the supply chain. And it created a lot of transparency on data and provided a basis for companies to facilitate this collaboration by creating transparency. Now, the effects were quite dramatic. Over the last year, the production in the UK North Sea has increased by about 4%. So quite dramatic when you think about 40 years of production coming down quite low, and you know, it's taken an uptick. Investment has gone up, and in the last round of exploration, they've had 80 companies bidding for 500 blocks. Right? So for an oil province that has been in production for such a long time and reaching the tail end of its life, this is quite a dramatic impact. So a lot of lessons to be taken from this case. Now, if I reflect a bit on what could be priorities for the oil industry, and as a bit of context, we as BCG have been working in Vietnam for the last 20 years and actively engaged in the energy sector for the last 5 years, both public and private sector. And based on our observations and some lessons learned, we'll leave you with five priorities that we think are important for the sector. The first is technology, and technology has dramatically improved the productivity of many oil companies in the range of 10, 15, 20% of productivity and capital productivity and operating cost productivity. Right? So huge impact, and this is applying technology at scale across operations in oil companies. Now, putting in the appropriate conditions to encourage this has been a big priority for many oil provinces, and Vietnam can do the same. The second is policy and regulatory actions to drive more investment. A bit similar to what the Oil and Gas Authority of the UK did, is to rethink what your fiscal regime is and improving the incentive structures to encourage investment. And it really comes down to this. It is better to have a smaller share of a large volume that will be produced versus a large share of a small or non-existent volume, right? So that really is the crux of it. The third is gas, domestic gas, and certainly in the short term, LNG plays a part because of the massive demand growth the country sees. Now, given the large resource that is yet to be developed and yet to be explored, there is some level of policy and regulatory action on the fiscal side and upstream that will incentivize development. But more than that, gas is really integrated. So you produce a molecule from a well, and you monetize that when it hits a gas plant and you produce power. So to do that, you need to think about the whole chain. So if you're thinking about the whole chain, what that means is that there is some level of gas market structure that needs to be reviewed and reformed. And fundamentally what this means is that for every molecule of gas that's produced, where is the margin going? From the upstream to the midstream to the downstream. And today, from our observations, it is somewhat disproportionate. It is margin is stuck in certain parts of the value chain, where if it were to be redistributed, you probably get more efficiency, investment, and more gas to market. So that's the third thing. The fourth is one that is true globally, and it will be true in Vietnam as well, is that oil and gas supply chains, and when I mean supply chains, I mean the service companies, the engineering companies, the OEMs, the second, third level vendors that you have inside there. There's huge inefficiency that's stuck inside, huge inefficiency, and a lot of that is driven by the historic nature of these markets, but also by the way oil companies have worked with their supply chains. And this is not addressable only by an oil company. It has to be facilitated by the state with appropriate policy and regulations that change the game between how oil companies and the supply chain works, and hence unlocks its potential. Now, an example is the UK, which we spoke about earlier, where the state was very interventionist in creating conditions where there was higher level of collaboration between service companies, but also oil companies and the supply chain. And the last point, and this is really a no regret because it's in the interest of the industry, is to decrease the carbon intensity of operations. Now, this is just good business. So in decreasing the carbon intensity improves your operating cost position, improves efficiency, and is accretive to the environment, right? And this is a no regret that every oil company and every oil province should focus on in driving change. So these are the 5 that we believe are important for the industry, and we can certainly speak more about that, in the Q&A. Thank you very much.